All right, it's 2:00. Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started with this afternoon's presentation. We don't want to waste any more time. We thank you for joining us for our panel discussion about BIPOC community and mental health. Before we get started, I first want to start off with some thanks. First to the American Society for Deaf Children, ASDC. And I want to make sure I get all of this appreciation right. And also to Signing By Stories, ABC. Thank you guys so much, both organizations, for really sponsoring and making this afternoon's event possible. I think we should get started, by us introducing ourselves. I will get us started. I am Alicia Allen. Okay. And I am currently the Assistant Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at NTID. Prior to that, I've actually had several years of experience in the therapy field, both individual one-on-one therapy as well as couples therapy. I've also have experience probably over 10 or 15, about 15 years of group therapy experience, providing that in a variety of different settings with a variety of different people in a variety of different walks of life. I would like to say that my clinical approach is very skills-based. I like to pick and choose from the different approaches that are out there. I do work with the BIPOC community, and we're going to talk about that later and how I have to modify some of my approaches to deal with individual clients and meeting their needs. So yes, that's a little bit about who I am, and I'll turn things over to, I guess, the next person who would like to volunteer to introduce themselves before we get started. Naima? Yes, I'm Naima. And I just want to explain a little bit about, give a little visual description about myself. I'm in a white background. I am wearing a yellow shirt with a flower on it. I have long curly hair. I wear glasses. I have a birthmark on my cheek, a nose ring, and a silver, which is silver, and some freckles. So, and thank you for remembering that, Naima. This is my sign name. And I am currently in graduate school for mental health counseling. Getting my master's, which means I will be slated to graduate in 2023. So I'm very ready, very, very ready to graduate. And I also currently work as an early intervention provider at the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. And I also work part-time with National Deaf Therapy. In addition to that, I consider myself a freestyle artist, which I do in my spare time. And that's very, very related to the concept of healing. Okay. And I use healing through the arts. I identify as deaf/hard of hearing. Okay. Oh, also, real quickly, I'm so sorry. Just to add, I'm also bi or multiracial. That's how I consider myself. Either term applies. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Dominique. It is a rather long name, but I go by Mimi for short. Okay. And this is my sign name. I graduated from RIT in 2020. And I am currently in grad school for art therapy.
So I see when I'm waiting.
And just like Neem, I am so ready to graduate. One more year. It's almost over.
So thank you for having this happen.
And thanks so much for having me be part of this discussion. Absolutely. And I apologize. I actually graduated with my PhD in clinical psychology from Gallaudet. I forgot to mention that. So I am a former student, and I'm happy to be turning the reins over to you guys in that capacity. So we actually have a list of questions that we wanted to go through today and just kind of have a conversation about anything that comes to mind. We want this to be very organic, and kind of let the conversation be free flowing. And then when we come to kind of the end of a topic, we'll just move on to the next question that we have. And actually, before we jump into that, we do want to say thank you to Naima for mentioning about just doing that description, that self-description for our deafblind community. Definitely, I'm remiss that I didn't do that myself, and I'll do mine and Mimi can do hers. I'm a Black woman. I have rainbow colored hair at the moment because it's Pride Month and I'm being very supportive. So kind of hard to see it on the screen, unfortunately. I have I guess you want to call it an Afro mohawk of sorts. That's the style I'm sporting today. I'm wearing a blue shirt. And again, Black woman wearing some earrings, and I have a cochlear implant. So, Mimi, you want to do your description?
So I'm wearing green hair, green.
So I've got green hair in braids.
Yeah, so I'm wearing green.
Rather bright, wearing a gray shirt.
Glasses.
I have glasses.
And
with a black headband. And I have a little nose ring.
Wow.
I also am a Black woman, Black deaf woman with a cochlear implant as well. All right, fantastic. Thank you. All right. So the first question we have for our panelists is, what does the mental health journey look like as a BIPOC person? So what does your mental health journey as a BIPOC individual look like? Who wants to get us started? I mean, you can speak for yourself. You can maybe speak based on what you've seen in your practice and your work.
Yeah.
Amy, you want to go ahead?
For me,
so for me, it's definitely had a lot of ups and downs.
But it's hard.
It's hard to describe. For myself, I grew up definitely struggling with anxiety.
So I remember that
childhood.
So I remember feeling.
And I remember many times I would feel anxious, for example, sweating, racing thoughts, feeling a sense of trepidation or fear, things like that. And I didn't get a lot of support. People would just say, oh, there's something wrong. And people really didn't understand. I thought there was something wrong with myself. And I struggled with that. And it wasn't until middle school that I actually got terminology to go along with what I was feeling and found out that it was called anxiety. However, I had a mindset of being strong and figuring that I could handle it and that I would be fine, but then really coming to realize that, I wasn't always fine. I was very lucky that I had a great support system that helped me come to that understanding, and that it was okay to feel sad and that it was okay to feel scared sometimes. But it took a long time for me to accept that.
It's okay to feel.
That it's okay to feel vulnerable and that it's okay to share those feelings of vulnerability. And some days I'm good. And then there are some days where I struggle a little bit more and, I kind of backslide a little bit. So, and I'm sure you guys can maybe relate to that experience. Absolutely. Naima? Sure. Well, first of all, I need to give kudos to the BIPOC community who don't necessarily accept those labels. Individuals have different perspectives in terms of how they want to be labeled and how they want to identify. So for the purposes of this, we're using the term BIPOC because both Mimi and what's your sign name again? Alicia. Okay, when we came up with this title, this is how we self-identify. I'm a multiracial, biracial individual. So each person does have their own mental health journey. And, we do not speak for everybody in the community. I can only speak to my experience. And my experience, I am half white and half Black. So my identity was always a struggle growing up in terms of where do I actually fit? Where do I belong? There's that fine line, where there's some things where that I feel like, am I included in this sense? Am I not included? And when it came to my mental health journey, it was always a struggle to find somebody who I could actually relate to in terms of a therapist, somebody who had similar experiences, somebody who I shared some commonality with, especially with my intersectionality and those identities. Being biracial, being white, being Black, being hard of hearing, and finding somebody who shared all that intersectionality was very difficult. So with me pursuing my mental health counseling degree, I really want to be somebody that other people can identify with in the future when they're looking for somebody for support. They can find somebody who they can identify with in me. I want to be able to provide that for individuals. We need more diversity in the counseling profession because I think one of the biggest struggles is, the people are struggling alone. I remember looking for a therapist and having a difficult time finding one. And I really had to try to navigate things myself. And I can't imagine how other people experience that. So I think it's going to be beneficial when I'm out in the field that other people will be able to find somebody they can identify with. And that, I guess, is part of my journey as a multiracial individual. And I'm hoping that in the future, I can provide to other people what I just didn't necessarily have access to. And to have that person who you can have empathy with, that you have that shared understanding with, because they've had that experience and already been there. Definitely. And I'm just going to add to the many experiences that you mentioned that I can relate to. I think another key and another important part we need to discuss is things from a systemic level and how the system doesn't really support individuals of color in general. And then specifically on top of that, mental health and that experience. Okay. Now, that, of course, might not look the same for everybody. No question. Some people, for example, I think I've seen it many times, Black individuals, are clearly depressed, but they don't appear depressed. It comes across as being tough, as being stoic, sometimes as being a little abrasive, or just trying to carry on. Whereas below the surface, you find out they're actually suffering from trauma or depression or things like that. Many, many members of the BIPOC community don't accept those types of labels and don't accept support, particularly in the mental health capacity. They really focus on religion as the thing you need to rely on, and that God will take care of things. And they minimize or don't look at the need for mental health because of, I think, a history of oppression and trauma. So what comes across as being stoic and what comes across as being successful really leads to a lot of stress of trying to appear strong and appear healthy and appear perfect when inside people are struggling, and to not show any type of quote unquote weakness of any kind, because that is considered negative within the culture and within the community. And so there's a lot of layers there. And I've seen that over and over and over again. So, and I think personally for myself, I see you guys relating to it. I think personally for myself, I have worked so hard through so many situations that a lot of people didn't think I'd be able to navigate. I mean, people ask me, how did you get straight A's? How are you able to do this? And it's ironic because later, after I graduated from Gallaudet and I settled down into the working field, I come to find out I have ADHD. I come to find out I have all these other things, and I had coping skills because I had to be tough. People see me as being successful, but they really don't see all the things that are kind of happening underneath, that are underlying. And it's really a double-edged sword, a catch-22, so to speak, putting on those appearances, but yet struggling. It's very, very complicated for sure. I just want to add to that. Absolutely. So quick story. I wanted to say that when you talk about things from a systemic level and the system, really we need to dismantle the system, particularly in the field of mental health. Society has taught, Black and brown people, who have experienced racial trauma from slavery that has been carried on through generations and generations, and it's cyclical. And we've been taught that we need to appear as tough because of all that history. So it's really ingrained in society, that we have to be tough and that we have to persevere and that we have to kind of just push through. We work 3 times, sometimes 100 times harder than white individuals, to traverse the same things. In addition to that, and I just lost my second thought. Oh, what was my second point? Oh, I lost it. Could I add real quick while you're waiting for it to come back to you? Sure, go ahead. Okay, so microaggressions. Can we talk about microaggressions? Absolutely. Because some people make comments like, oh, you're fine. And if you express being stressed, they'll go, oh, you're fine. You're a strong Black woman. You're tough. That phrase, strong Black woman. I mean, there are so many examples of that I could list. That really is just more oppressive. And it's almost like you feel the need to prove people wrong, but that puts a lot of stress on a person. Yes, having good coping skills is wonderful, but really the impetus of those good coping skills is because of the way we're viewed by society, the way that, our feelings are marginalized and the way that we're oppressed and the way our thoughts and our feelings aren't viewed as important, and the way people keep saying, though, such and such was in the past, that shouldn't have any lasting impact. It's almost like, we don't have the ability and we're not given the time or the space we need to grieve, to grieve for that past trauma as it relates to slavery, as it relates to discrimination, as it relates to all the collective prejudice that we've experienced. Mimi, you're a little freezy. You're a little freezy. Okay, now you're better. Can you go back? And you were just saying, I think you were talking about, that we weren't allowed to grieve for all those residual traumas that we've basically been indoctrinated that way. And then what did you say right after that? Oh, my apologies. Yeah. So I can certainly relate to those people who are people of color. Other folks might not be able to relate to that collective experience and not be able to understand what we've gone through in our lives and the fact that we've needed to persevere. And those words and comments really do have an impact on us. No, so I think people need to give us the time that we need to process. Absolutely. And I just want to add real quickly, when you do get the courage to say something, to speak up, and then it's minimized. I mean, sometimes people blatantly say you're either exaggerating or you're making something up, or, oh, it's not that bad, or whatever the comment is that they make. When that happens, okay, there's a cross between, microaggressions and gaslighting almost, you know what I mean? It's like that gaslighting phenomena that happens. And those two things intersect in a lot of cases to the point where you start to internalize that and you start to actually question yourself as to maybe I am making this up. Maybe it isn't that bad. No, that's not the case. It really is complex and it really is, yeah. I just wanted to mention a little bit about the impacts that this has on mental health when it comes to skin color and racism and how these things show up too. Like myself, I am light-skinned and I have what's called light skin privilege as compared to dark skin and dark skin privilege. Some people are more accepting of light skin. Some people are more accepting of dark skin. So that has an overarching impact on a person's mental health. Absolutely. I was actually just thinking about colorism in the mental health field. And also, okay, so I work at the National Technical Institute to the Deaf, of which is under RIT. And there's a huge lab on campus, and it's a mix of psychology, mental health, so forth and so on. It's all within one facility, which is really fascinating. And I was just reading an article, okay, and 2020, this is just from 2020, that first year medical students in 2020 still think that dark-skinned individuals, particularly dark-skinned individuals, Black folks, manage pain differently than lighter skinned individuals. They think they have a greater ability to manage pain. And that was so eye-opening in 2020. That's still happening. Okay, so this isn't ancient history. This is recent. That belief is still very prevalent. And there's a lot of different beliefs that skin color impacts the ability to manage pain, which is scary. I mean, these things are still prevalent today. And that kind of relates back to mental health. Certainly, I'm sure, that causes trauma, and that leads to ongoing trauma, and even the ability to access mental health in the same way that other people can. So anyway, just wanted to say that. That's a really good discussion. Okay. So I'm just looking at some of our questions because I think sometimes we've answered some of these within other questions. So I want to kind of pick something that's a good segue, but I don't want to. Okay. On that note, given what we know, what exactly does mental health mean for you as an individual? I mean, we were just talking about, what the journey looks like and the different issues and barriers that we face. So what is mental health? I mean, what does that mean? What comes to mind? Naima? I think mental health is about what makes you you, right? What makes you who you are. You have a history, you have a story, you have a story to tell. You have all these different events that have happened in your life, all these things that have happened over the course of your journey, things that have made an impact on who you are today. So it really is holistically how you navigate your identity, who you are, the journey to figure out who you are, finding who you are, accepting who you are. Some people have anxiety, some people deal with trauma. We all have to learn to accept all of these facets of who we are. We need to understand that they're okay. We need to understand that when we have mental health issues, it's okay. And we have to learn to move forward with life, to process that, to develop those coping skills. So really, I think mental health is what makes you who you are. Absolutely right. I think the same thing. Absolutely. For me, I think I want to add, it's like building a great support system, building a community that you can share with. I feel fortunate to have platforms like this where we can share so you don't feel so alone and isolated, because it's hard feeling alone, where you don't have anybody that you can share with and say, for example, like I've got anxiety, and you can find people who relate to that and find some commonality and find some people who can have empathy for what you're going through and find somebody who can understand what you're going through. Finding that common ground, those common things you can share with, and having those discussions and that dialogue, and shining a spotlight on mental health. I think that's really important. Yeah, it's interesting. So, okay. I've had a very colorful, rich experience before arriving at my current role. I also taught at NTID for 5 years. And one of the courses I taught was, abnormal psychology. And two class periods were spent on the word abnormal. What do we consider abnormal? What does that even mean? And how do we make a decision that this is normal and this is not normal or abnormal? Because in other parts of the world, this might be generally accepted, but here in this society, it's not. So we really did a deep dive into that and really, reverse engineered it and looked at examples and how that's sometimes not addressed. And to be honest, there's a lot of diagnoses out there that don't have a whole lot of empirical evidence behind them for some of those diagnoses. We just like to categorize a bunch of symptoms and say, yep, this is XYZ, and label people who have those symptoms as such. And it really makes you think, what exactly is mental health? Is it good, the ability to regulate your feelings and your emotions and your thought process in a way that society has deemed acceptable? Or is it something a little bit deeper than that? That's always something we discuss. And I think it's such a fascinating discussion, so many different things come up when you're having that conversation. I think for me, it's all about, having physical health, having spiritual health, and then having that mental health piece. And I think the mental health piece is like kind of the brains of everything, and figuring out how to kind of make everything work together synergistically. If any one of those three things is out of alignment, it's going to impact something else, and you're going to need maybe the other two to support it. And not to say that, spiritual health means you need to have religion. It just means the spiritual part could be just, that self piece, that belief in yourself, that belief in your skills and the strengths that you have within you. It could be your connection with a higher being. It could be just relating to the earth. It really is up to you to decide. But I think how you manage all three of those facets of yourself, for good or for bad. And then, of course, my question is, when it's bad, let's talk about those coping skills. Is it because these coping skills are acceptable and that's why it's considered good versus these coping skills are not acceptable? I mean, all mental health professionals use the same line, hurt people, if what you're doing is hurting others, that's a problem. It could, so that you could be labeled crazy like you were before, and you might not be labeled as such until you hurt somebody else. So it's just always a fascinating discussion, that question, when we try to define mental health, and it always leads to such like an unpacking, and we could talk about it all day, because it's really, there's so many underlying parts of that. But good discussion, and thank you. Did anybody have anything else they want to? Naima actually, who wants to go first? Mimi? Okay. Mimi, and then Naima. Okay. I actually feel the same way about it. And sometimes it kind of bothers me seeing, things being categorized as normal or abnormal, especially things that come from the pathological point of view, and I see that, for example, a doctor might say, what are your symptoms? What do your symptoms look like? And then they want to fix your behavior, for example, or they want to fix something about you. The focus is on, how to cure something. But they never really noted, they never really ask, how are you feeling? They never really want to unpack it. They never validate the feelings that you're having, or they never kind of look for the underlying cause, be it trauma or whatever the case may be. You don't get that sense of empathy a lot of times. A lot of time it's very cold. It's very diagnostic. And that's why I want to become a therapist. I really want to change that paradigm. And I really want the focus to be more on the person as an individual, and really validating their feelings as a human first, and their emotions, and not just trying to diagnose or look down on somebody who, has a mental illness or a mental challenge. I want to do away with that schema. I think everybody is struggling. Anybody could develop a mental illness in the future.
That's why I'm still,
and that definitely, the way it's gone historically, bothers me. No question. Absolutely. Nima? I just want to add to your comment about, the system and identifying normal versus abnormal in that comment. I know we've talked about ADHD and PTSD and that misdiagnosis that happens so commonly. Really, a lot of these children who have ADHD are often misdiagnosed PTSD sufferers, believe it or not. It comes from traumas, particularly BIPOC, Black and brown kids growing up seeing a lot of trauma, seeing the news and seeing, things about police brutality, so forth and so on. So there's a lot of misdiagnosis out there in the field. And I think it's important to be very careful about the diagnoses that are being given out by mental health professionals. And I think they need to be able to diagnose correctly. And counselors and therapists, typically a lot of these theories are white centric and white based in terms of their approach, and they're not aligned with the diverse cultures that are out there, and they need to be. And that's something that we need to be very cognizant and mindful of. As BIPOC individuals go and seek therapy, they need to make sure that their therapist has that cultural competency that they can give a correct diagnosis. Man, you hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. Absolutely. Shoot. How many times do people go into a therapy session with an individual who doesn't look like them, who's probably white, who has white philosophy and white centric framework for their therapy, And the other forgotten part of the picture is not just the trauma that they've been exposed to, so forth and so on, but also the approach with the understanding that this person already has everything they need. Not that they have everything they need, but basically meaning some BIPOC folks might not have the resources or tools or have access to the resources or tools that many other people of privilege have. I mean, I was talking with Nima about, deaf services, and which I used to work with, and working with these children who are responsible for taking care of their family, individuals who had substance abuse issues, who were working full time, and who get home. This is an 8-year-old, 8 years old, not older, 8-year-old, taking care of younger siblings, 3 or 4 years old, making sure they get fed, so forth and so on. And then to sit down in a therapy session, and do a therapeutic approach when this person hasn't even eaten yet. They haven't even had their basic needs met yet. I think it's being overlooked. So I think a lot of the therapeutic interventions that are out there, for lack of a better word, are based on an understanding that somebody already has their basic needs being met, that they have that privilege. And that's very a white middle-class privilege perspective. You're not thinking about, some of the other populations that are out there and their truth and their experiences and their cultures. So definitely. And I was also thinking about, somebody made the comment, I think it was Mimi, said something about that made me think about the environment and how important the environment is to mental health. And the focus is always on treating the individual and what's wrong with the individual. And therapists don't often think about changes in the environment. And that might be the only thing that the person needs. A deaf and hard of hearing kid might be exhibiting behaviors, right? But maybe they don't have access. And if they got access, that would solve the problem. It would take care of it. I was reading another article that was just talking about not a big number of diagnoses of ADHD in some populations in Europe. Well, if you look at what they're doing, they're outside a whole lot in Europe. They're not sitting at desks all day, being tested continuously. They go outside, I think, at least 2 hours a day in their system. They might only be sitting at a desk writing an hour or two a day. They're out there interacting with the community. They're learning through movement. I mean, I know, I stand as a professor and lecturer. I move around a lot. If I were to sit, for hours and hours at a time, I wouldn't be able to do it. So imagine an 11 to 12-year-old, a 13-year-old having to sit all day, class after class after class, 6 or 7 classes a day trying to attend. So is it really ADHD, or is it really they're just tired of sitting and it's an environmental issue? So I think environmental change sometimes is all that's needed. And that's definitely not getting the attention. Did anybody else want to? Okay. All right, I'm looking at our questions. Okay. All right, we already kind of covered that one. All right, let's talk about identity. Identities come up. I think that's a good transition. So what are the identities that you have which may affect your mental health as an individual? So not only BIPOC, but what other intersectionality? I mean, I'm thinking, Naima mentioned this briefly, but just generally speaking, personality wise, how are some of those other identities impacted in this whole process? You want to start? Now, who wants to? Okay, I'll start. Well, I already mentioned that I'm bi or multiracial. So I grew up with white counselors in school. The school counselors were all white. So I struggled. I didn't find myself very comfortable connecting and expressing myself. Biracial or Black or mixed individuals were people I felt more of a rapport with. But growing up with white counselors, I really had a hard time and I didn't really feel like I connected with them, but you did what you had to do. And then I got older and I went into college and I experienced some trauma during college. So I decided I needed to seek some therapy. And I looked and I just couldn't find anybody. Finding somebody that was either Black or biracial was difficult. I wanted somebody who I could connect with. I also wanted somebody who spoke my language. Again, very difficult to find. My school required me to get counseling prior to my internship. which makes total sense because it gives you the experience of sitting on the other side of the chair. So I picked a counselor, hearing Black therapist. Okay. So we had to utilize an interpreter because they didn't sign. So I finally had somebody that I could connect with, you know, and unfortunately my insurance didn't cover that. So I had to pay for it out of pocket. And that's another barrier that systemically people often face. I had to pay every 2 weeks to meet with this particular therapist. And I did see a lot of benefits. I think everybody should experience counseling, but at the same time, I do recognize there are some systemic barriers. And it took me a long time to find a therapist because of what I was seeking in other therapists, somebody I could relate to and connect with, you know, in terms of my identities and that intersectionality, which wasn't there, especially as a deaf and hard of hearing person. I wanted somebody that I could use my language with directly and not go through a third person. College provided interpreters for therapy, but I was left lacking because I didn't have that direct communication. Now, my therapist was able, if they had been able to sign directly to me, that would have been great, you know, and I like that. So I think basically, you know, the identities really impact our journey in terms of finding somebody who we can connect with, somebody who we can develop that rapport and that relationship with in a therapeutic setting. Mimi, you want to go ahead? Well, I identify as Black, deaf, female, cisgendered. So
really too, but for looking for.
When it comes to looking for a therapist, it definitely was a challenge to find somebody. All the counselors, all the therapists I saw were white hearing individuals. Some of them did no sign, some of them didn't. So, you know, trying your best to communicate with them, trying your best to like share and vent, it just was very difficult with all the barriers out there. There was a lot of miscommunication. Now, there were times where I experienced some success, but there were a lot of frustrations as well. And trying to navigate that and find that right individual. And I would say sometime between middle school and high school, I did have an experience with some trauma. And I had to go to counseling, and the counselor was white. They did no sign. She was very sweet. She was able to help me a lot. And she helped me name and identify all the feelings and the emotions that I was having. But at the same time, you know, I still had this, you know, sitting there with that therapist, I really still remember thinking, gosh, you know, I wish this person was somebody I could relate to better. I wish this was a Black, deaf individual. They would have a better understanding of where I was coming from. They would have a better understanding of how my identities impact my mental health. A white therapist is only going to be able to scratch the surface. It's going to be more superficial. It's going to focus more on, you know, just the mental health and the diagnosis without looking at the underlying intersectionalities and how those really have an impact. So it systemically had an impact on my mental health. And experiencing those microaggressions is not something a white therapist is not going to be able to understand. Now, I did eventually find a good therapist, not somebody who signed, here individual, but we were still able to have good conversations. I was able to communicate with them, you know, very well. And that worked very successfully for me. And we were able to have that direct interaction.
I know that.
But I did notice within myself that there is a certain level of privilege there because I was born deaf, but I have a cochlear implant. So I grew up using spoken language and having auditory access. So I am able to have much smoother communication with the hearing therapist. And I honestly didn't realize how much therapy I had until, you know, I saw several other individuals who had the same type of privilege, you know, and the fact that we can communicate and we don't have to worry about, you know, that struggle. I mean, I do still struggle as a deaf person, but having a cochlear implant, having that auditory access, you know, and having been mainstreamed in the hearing world gives me more options when it comes to communications. And when I realized that, that was really eye-opening for me. And I had that conversation with the therapist and we talked about that. And this wasn't a deaf therapist. And they tried their best to understand, you know, and they tried their best to kind of give me the support I needed. But I have to admit, and they actually had to kind of admit to themselves that that wasn't a schema that they really understood. I mean, I've had to do some kind of self-analysis and realized how important it is to have more deaf therapists out there, you know, particularly for people of color, and to have therapists that represent them. I've only met, I can't even tell you, like very, very few, one or two licensed BIPOC therapists. So, and in my field of art therapy, I think I've met maybe one or two people of color. And I felt like, wow, where are these professionals? And that's what kind of led me to what I'm doing now. We definitely need more people in the field, no question. And it actually relates to my research paper, talking about mental health and people of color and the need for accessibility and how few resources there are out there. I mean, again, like I said, only one or two individuals, which isn't enough. And that's when I realized, you know, there's a big need out there in terms of access, in terms of resources, and we definitely need to encourage and support more folks to go into the field. We need more people to help that population. Absolutely. Definitely. And I was just listening to both of you, and I'm just thinking of a whole nother layer that doesn't get discussed too terribly often. And, you know, I can speak to this specifically because it's me, is that because there are so few Black or people of color, BIPOC, deaf, hard of hearing mental health therapists, how easy it is to become burnt out when you're in that role, and how easy it is to say, you know what, you know, this is wonderful and I've enjoyed the work. I mean, it is extremely rewarding, but I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to take a break. Not only because of burnout, but also because a lot of that therapy induces you reliving your own trauma from time to time. You know, having to be exposed through working with people of color and their experiences, you know, and myself also being a person of color, being able to find those boundaries, being able to practice that self-care and the skill of being able to reduce, that residual trauma, and being able to reduce that vicarious trauma through therapy. It's a very small community too. So, you know, you go out and you're hanging out with other BIPOC individuals that are members of your community, but you now have two roles and you're operating in two capacities. So having to manage all of those layers for the therapist, for the therapist of color, is not often something that gets discussed. You know, I think we look at, and for example, Naima mentioned and talked a little bit about having an interpreter in the room and her experience and that process. I've actually had a colleague who is doing their research. Well, all of us, you know, you have to do a dissertation to get a PhD, of course. And my focus was on the hard of hearing community and the hard of hearing identity. I loved that work. However, this individual, this colleague of mine, their focus for their dissertation was the impact of an interpreter and how that shifts the therapeutic process and the dynamic for the deaf and hard of hearing individual in the room, particularly if we're talking about an individual that is a person of color, and how, you know, they might be reserved or they might not say certain things, you know, in their old culture because they're trying to filter things out because of other folks in the room, you know, and not being able to have somebody who's really going to be able to empathize and understand what their meaning is. So a person already going into the therapy room with stress about the therapy session because there's an interpreter present, you know, that's just an added layer, not just for the client, but for the therapist as well. I mean, myself, I provide these services both to deaf and hearing individuals, deaf and hearing clients. And if there's an interpreter in the room, okay, and just like Mimi mentioned, I have privilege in that I am able to speak clearly and I have some auditory access. And there are some people where we have to excuse the interpreter, you know, if I can understand them. And if I can't understand them, then sometimes, you know, I will have the interpreter in the room. However, I have them sit behind the client so they're not obtrusive. Either way, the point is therapy itself, the therapist itself has the extra work of reviewing things with the interpreter, of communicating with the interpreter. Okay. Most people work a 9 to 5. I have an 8 to 6 schedule because I have to do all that logistical work when it comes to the interpreter, you know, and how they need to conduct themselves in the therapy session before we go in and even start the day and start the process. And then at the end, you have to sit there and debrief with the interpreter and put them back together and make sure they're okay before I can even go home, which is a lot. It's a lot of extra work. So there are challenges on both ends and stresses on both ends, not only for the client, but also for the provider, and it just speaks to the fact that there is such a need in the field for more practitioners. I mean, let me see, there are 4, I think I've had 4 therapists in my life, and 3 were white. 1 was Jewish, was fantastic. That was the one. I mean, the two were okay. The one who was Jewish, oh my goodness, they could sign. They were fantastic. She also was very immersed in social justice work. So she was able to name a lot of my experiences in a way that I really understood. Ironic, because she was a white individual, but she really had done a deep dive, and she was doing the work herself and processing in real time herself, and probably had her own experiences as a Jewish woman. She was Orthodox. I mean, isn't it ironic? She was Orthodox Jewish woman, and I'm a, Black woman, and she, of course, dressed as an Orthodox woman, but she was more woke than most people I'd ever met. But it was fantastic. And just ironically, in Philadelphia, So then I moved here to Rochester, and I struggled. Rochester was such a large deaf population. I struggled, and I was finally able to find a Latino woman, and she talked a lot about history, the history of trauma, of being a woman, as a Black woman, as a person of color. She was fantastic. And again, there's some privilege of being able to go in and interact and understand, because I have some access. I didn't have an interpreter. I think an interpreter would have impacted her ability to relate to me and my ability to relate to her. But I had the privilege of being able to work without an interpreter. I think during COVID, I'm not with her anymore, but during COVID, working remotely on a screen was okay. It's always better in person because I have a better ability to lip read. But on the screen, there was definitely a little more work involved. And I'm trying to, as we went through therapy, but if we're talking about a breakthrough, if we were talking about like grief or whatever the case may be, sometimes you don't have the mental energy or the mental bandwidth, to use your bandwidth to try to understand. You just want to emote. You just want to express. You don't want to have to worry about just trying to use all that mental bandwidth to communicate. It's just added work to be able to develop that relationship with a therapist to make sure you have a good therapeutic experience when communication is a barrier. Okay. That being said, I am looking at the time. It is now 2:46. So we have less than 15 minutes left. And I'm thinking, just looking at the questions, we really did cover a lot of these topics in a roundabout way. And I think it would be cool. And you let me know what your thoughts are if you think differently. But I want to really kind of wrap up on self-care. I think that's really important. But I think Naima had her hand up. So please, by all means. So you're talking about therapists and identifying that every person has the opportunity to do things like go to college. Okay. And for a lot of different reasons, a lot of different systemic reasons, a lot of times the system isn't designed to accommodate everybody. And I think it's important because not everybody has a support system in place. So for those individuals who have the privilege to go to college, I think they need to kind of uplift and support other folks. So I think it needs to be kind of a community of support. Like before I started my graduate program, I did look for, and I couldn't find a mentor. I really wanted a mentor. I really specifically wanted a BIPOC mentor. I finally found somebody who I consider my mentor, not formal, it's informal, but I do have some role models that I look up to, some people who I can go to, which is really nice to have. And I think that support system to be able to navigate, particularly college, which is very white centric, it has a very white centric and egocentric approach to everything, is important. We need to have those supports in place, and we need to be mindful of supporting others. Absolutely. That is so important. I couldn't agree more. And I think people often ask me in my current role, like, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do to help? This is awful. What can I do? And really, to be honest with you, I mean, aside from, fighting on a federal level for equal access and, making sure that there's equity and things like that. Some simple things you can do is call out family members when they say things that are off-putting about Black people. It's those kind of simple things. Taking accountability or taking responsibility off those other folks. If you've got Black or brown colleagues at work, have those conversations of, do they feel heard in a meeting room, for example, in a boardroom, in a conference room? Is there any way you can kind of to give you an example, I'll never forget this simple gesture. So simple. Okay. Another white man, I'm in spaces very often with white men, very often. Okay. Just part of my role at RIT, particularly when you're looking at the administrative level, it's predominantly white men. And I had somebody, I was making a statement and then people weren't paying attention and somebody would say the exact same thing. And one person spoke up and said, Alicia just made that comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Dr. Allen just made that comment already. And I was like, thank you, friend. So, it's simple things like that, simple gestures, like calling people out. They're not big. They're not huge. You don't have to do huge institutional type changes. It's the little things. Start at home, start with your office, start in your living room with a basic conversation, read some books, do that self-analysis and that unpacking. Those are all little things you can do. Okay. But I'm going off and I want to bring it back to self-care. So anything you guys want to add? Anybody? No, not that, please, we could go on and on. Okay. Yes. Self-care. Let's talk about self-care. I think that's a great and important way to wrap up because I think even for myself, I can speak to it. Sometimes I get angry when people talk about take care of yourself, make sure you take care of yourself. They're not recognizing that being able to take care of yourself in and of itself has privilege. Even my boss, who's a white guy, will say you need to make sure you take care of yourself, not recognizing, that the minority tax is big, that my job, my role in my field, there are a constant stream of Black and brown students coming into my office or coworkers coming into my office. And it's not just, job related. It's also support and mentorship and validating everybody's experience. Sometimes it's just validation that they're looking for. And all of this takes time. So you want me to find time to take care of myself, and when I get home, I now have kids that I also have to take care of. I got a 5-year-old, I got a husband, I got a house that does not clean itself. I have a life. And then I operate in a world that's very oppressive to Black and brown women. And I have to navigate that world. And then you want me to practice self-care. So anyway, it is important. It's still important. I'm not saying it's not important, and I think people have different definitions of what self-care is and what that looks like for them. So what do you do for self-care? What do you recommend that's out there for self-care? How do you practice self-care?
Okay.
Mimi?
Yeah.
So I think including resources, like the general idea of self-care. I think people think like, oh, take a bath or light some candles or get your nails done. Right. It doesn't have to be that. Right. It doesn't have to be that, but it can be something short. Just, I think really what self-care is, it's, focusing on prioritizing your mental and your physical needs, making sure you get 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night, recognizing how you feel, art, using that to express yourself or whatever the case may be, putting things down on paper, either in poetry or in art. Like myself, for self-care, it looks like unplugging from social media. Yes, definitely unplugging from social media and really taking the time to kind of decompress. Journaling, getting my thoughts down on paper is another good way. And then last, of course, making art. For me, making art is paramount. I love to paint. That is really how I take that time for me. That's really cool. Nima? So this Nima speaking. I love naps. I'm a nap nap fan. I'm the nap queen. So I will take I would take a nap every day if I could. Life happens, which makes that somewhat difficult. But, I took a vacation and I was able to nap. And so that is my self-care. I will do things that I need to do. That's really important. I also do art like Mimi does in my free time. Like I said, I do a lot of freestyle art. And I love going to the gym. I enjoy working out. That's my release, not having to worry about everything. I put my phone on do not disturb mode. I listen to music and I do my thing. What else? And, I have to say, cooking, watching shows, trying new kinds of food, going out with friends and family, all of those, happy hours, things like that. There you go. Happy hour. Oh yeah. I cannot miss a happy hour. Do not ever miss a happy hour. That's a must. Absolutely. And they're cheap drinks and cheap apps. That's the way to go about it. No, absolutely. And Emma, you made a good point about exercise, physical care. I think that kind of kills two birds with one stone. You've got the physical care, which is equally important part of self-care, taking care of your body. And I completely agree with both of you on what you had to say. I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of what I do. I know for me, personal boundaries is very tough. With everything that's going on in my life, learning and practicing that I need to set some strict boundaries is great. And actually following through with that, and not, letting those boundaries come down. It's tough to follow the boundaries I set sometimes and to keep those in place. And sometimes you have to be flexible with those boundaries. Sometimes you have to be a little bit more strict with them. Sometimes you have to be a little bit more lenient. And I think that's okay. Whatever I need to do to protect my peace, and I think self-preservation is key. That's another important thing. In Philadelphia, a lot of work has been done with inner city youth, looking at self-preservation. And sometimes when I work with those youth, I have to practice those skills myself. For example, when I get done work, I have to watch something, the 30th movie over and the 30th time about racism or something like that, or some unspoken thing that Black people have to, watch, because we've heard about it. No, you don't. I'm already Black in America. I've already experienced that. I do not need to watch and re-traumatize myself. I've read about it. I've heard about it. It doesn't mean because, you watch it, you're Blacker than somebody else. I get very, very frustrated. There's many people who make those films, like Adhd, she's fantastic. I love her work. And because of her work, there is training for mental health professionals. They actually work with the actors and do all these things, and they provide resources before and after you do the viewing of some of her things. However, if you watch her movie, you don't necessarily have access to those same folks to process all those things that are named in that movie, and all those things. And people process things a variety of ways. So I think self-care and self-preservation is important, whatever that means for you. And if it means not watching something or it means watching something, I think you don't want to expose yourself to things if you can't help it. If you're Black or brown in America, I think you're already doing enough. No matter where you are, you're already experiencing enough. And you're experiencing it in many areas of your life, including things like access to healthcare and religion. And even, internment, some people think funerals aren't that big of a deal, going to a funeral and things like that. There is a racial impact in that. There's an experience. My grandfather, he passed away some time ago, but he talked about, he couldn't bury his mom for a good year. And this experience, because basically, she passed away in December and the ground was frozen and they had to wait till it thawed. And this was in the South, this was in Louisiana. So these people were basically left, they left the coffins. And my other grandfather from Ohio, he was in Ohio, so he couldn't travel back and forth. So he was just waiting to hear when the ground thawed, and they would just say, not yet. And he would drive down to find out if they were able to do the funeral. And he ended up digging the grave himself. So it's those types of things. It's those types of experiences, because people are marginalized. People can't even grieve in an appropriate, peaceful way because of the way the system, has this systemic ingrained depression. So I think it's important to take care of yourselves, set boundaries, sleep, eat, take those naps. I watch a lot of trashy TV because that's what I do. Any show, anything I can binge, anything like that. Absolutely. I mean, that's just, I'll watch it because it gives me that time to disconnect and to immerse myself in somebody's pretend drama life. And then I can sleep and I'm recharged when I wake up and I'm re-energized to start it all over again. So anyway, it is now 3:00. Right before 3:00, I want to real quickly extend some gratitude before we close to ASDC. And please follow social media and ABC Signing Storytime. Follow the social media, follow all their things. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our community for coming and listening to us today. We really, really appreciate it. I really hate to cut off the conversation, but it's 3:00 and I was told 3:00, we're done. So thank you guys so much for being here. Appreciate to our panelists and just thank you so much.